Hello, and welcome back to Radio Mercenary. Today, we'll be telling the tale of the CIA assassination of Trujillo by Robert Roman, first published in Soldier of Fortune magazine, 1975. Our author's life typifies that of many a soldier of fortune, particularly in his unerring ability to pick the losing side. He first saw action at age 16 in World War II, in the Merchant Marine, when he manned a 20mm gun and shot the tail assembly off of a plane during an air raid in New Guinea. His feat was not applauded, however, since it was an American plane. He followed that up by 4 years in the Marines, serving mainly in China, when the U.S. made a vain effort to prop up the nationalist regime. It was during this time, while selling cigarettes and 45s on the black market, that he fell in with a General Chen, a private warlord who commanded a small army called the Chi Phao Brigade. Our Marine Private First Class went AWOL and was promoted to captain in the brigade, which was promptly annihilated by the Chinese communists. Breathless but unscarred, he rejoined the Marines and was not even court-martialed, as his company commander found his misadventure amusing. Next came the Caribbean and Central America. He went to work for the late Tacho Somoza, dictator of Nicaragua, as a consultant. Tacho was later assassinated. There was also a stint as an automatic weapons instructor with a Guatemalan exile army led by Carlos Castillo Armas. He also got in the way of somebody's bullet. Roman was now ready for the big time. He joined the service of the late Generalissimo Rafael Leónidas Trujillo, benefactor de la patria y padre de la patria nueva, again as a consultant. Today he works for another foreign power engaged in a life-and-death struggle. Needless to say, his side is losing. Of his career as a soldier of fortune, Roman says cheerfully, "I should have been a linoleum salesman." Trujillo. It was really a very stupid way to assassinate somebody. 2 cars followed the 1957 Chevrolet down Avienda, George Washington, and ahead were 2 cars waiting to intercept it. However, as later reconstructed, no real effort was made to block the highway, and the Chevrolet could have sped right on through. Instead, when the first shots were fired, the car's lone passenger ordered the car to stop, got out, and started banging away with his pistol. His assailants were using American automatic M2 carbines, and he was riddled. This was the end of the era of Trujillo, of Generalissimo Rafael Leónidas Trujillo Molina, and of my job. The place was the Dominican Republic, but it could have been almost anywhere. Virtually everybody connected with the assassination is now dead, but there was one eyewitness to the scene. He was General Arturo España, former chief of Trujillo's military intelligence, and one of his closest advisors. By strange coincidence, a very strange coincidence, Arturo was out for a drive that evening and wandered right into the ambush. He described it this way. Trujillo's Chevrolet was parked in the center of the 4-lane highway. On the right was a car facing in the same direction as the Chevrolet. On the left was another car with bright headlights, which illuminated the scene. A third car was beyond and to the right, facing Trujillo's car. I could see men firing furiously at the figure who staggered into the beam of the headlights. The old man fired a last bullet, then pitched forward on his face. Trujillo was dead. And with that, Arturo used to say, he spun the car around and drove off to give the alarm. He also took over the Dominican Republic, at least temporarily. Arturo moved swiftly. He drove directly to the home of General Jose Roman and seized him. Roman was leader of the Dominicans involved in the conspiracy, and was to have become provisional president after Trujillo. Roman was hauled into the intelligence center behind the National Palace and was told to start talking. He did, and, before he was finally finished off by expert torturers, implicated scores of people. What happened next was not nice. I've seen that sort of thing in various parts of the world. Otherwise ordinary people suddenly convulsed by a sort of blood frenzy. Perhaps the potential is there in all of us. And certainly the U.S. government, as represented by the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department, is not above setting up these little scenes. A lot of people died because of what happened that day in May 1961, and the responsibility is theirs. However, there's no denying that the old man, in many ways, brought it on himself. He was the big daddy of the Caribbean, and delighted in stirring up the natives. Venezuela, Guatemala, Haiti, anything within range. At one point, he developed a dandy feud with Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. Life was rather complicated during that period. I got rather confused when our propaganda apparatus began blasting Batista as a communist. It was even more confusing when Trujillo brought in a swarm of Cuban rebels, some of them real communists, and armed and trained them. He went further and began to run arms and ammo into Cuba. Later, Fidel Castro was to find them very useful. One of the pilots ferrying around the Cuban rebels and the guns was a loudmouth romanticist who thought he was Captain Midnight. His name was Gerald Lester Murphy. As a mercenary, Murphy was a disgrace to our trade. It was about that time that the Galindez case broke, specifically March 12, 1956. You may remember it. Jesus Galindez, head of the Spanish Basque Revolutionary Movement in North America, disappeared. Trujillo was blamed for it generally, and Arturo Espaillat, then consul general in New York, was accused specifically. The media had a field day. Then came the Murphy incident. It seems that Murphy had been boozing it up in the bars and bragging that he had kidnapped Galindez, though in fact the CIA had. The CIA was perturbed that of the $1 million+ given to Galindez to funnel to the Basques, only 500,000 reached its destination. Murphy realized the error of his ways and made plans to leave the country. Too late. He went off a cliff into the sea, assisted by one Octavio de la Maza, on orders of Trujillo, who resented being accused of the Galindez kidnapping. The state government got very upset and demanded a full investigation. I helped prepare an investigative report sent to the American Embassy, but I probed into that case very gingerly, afraid of what I might find, and add myself to the daisy chain of deaths. De la Maza had liquidated Murphy, on orders, of course, but the trail led straight to him. The embassy demanded action. They got action, but not what they expected. Trujillo had De la Maza thrown in jail and charged with murdering Murphy. De la Maza was understandably annoyed at his situation and announced he was going to tell all. He apparently changed his mind because he strangled himself in his cell. De la Maza was a brawny character and had to be assisted on his way by a half-dozen strong-backed secret police. I still get chills, like right now, when I think about episodes like that and how damned dangerous it was to work for a man like Trujillo. I must have been out of my mind. I was an absolutely loyal Trujillista, yet I knew that loyalty with him didn't work both ways. He might reward you lavishly one day and send you over a cliff the next, not out of anger or any emotion, but just out of sheer expediency. Yet the sheer danger of working for that tiger had an exhilarating quality. Maybe I'm a masochist. Publicity about Galindez and Murphy continued, and so did political pressure on Trujillo. The De la Maza incident was largely ignored, but one who didn't forget it was his brother, Antonio. It was Antonio de la Maza who was a key figure in the group that liquidated Trujillo, and it was very probable that the first CIA contact with the group was through him. Needless to say, he's dead now. The thing is, the whole cover of the conspiracy had always been paper thin, and the conspirators started babbling out the details, virtually from the moment they were apprehended. That didn't stop Ramfis, Trujillo's son, from torturing them to death. He was quite literally mad with rage. He killed them so fast that a really exhaustive analysis of the plot was impossible. I conducted such an analysis with personnel captured during the invasions from Cuba, and an elaborate conspiracy known as the 14th of June movement. I'd managed to keep my sources alive and talking. Ramfis chopped up Big Daddy's murderers so fast that they never had time to tell the whole story. Too bad. But here's the basic story. The CIA station chief of the American Embassy in the Dominican Republic was a chap named Lear B. Reed. He made no bones about it. In the summer of 1960, Reed came to the palace with an odd story. He said his visit was completely unofficial and that he was jeopardizing his career, but because of his abiding affection for the old man, he wanted to warn him. Either Trujillo resigns or Washington will send in the Navy. It was a transparent CIA ultimatum. I submitted a memo to the old man labeling it preposterous. Then he indicated I should make some sort of response. So I wrote a little piece about the mysterious blatherskite slithering around among us who is known only as LBR and operates the local candy store for the company, and put it on the front page of a local paper. Trujillo loved it. Reed quietly left the country. But that did it. Washington flashed the green light, and the final solution of the Trujillo question began. It had already been in the works for months. 2 officials attached to the embassy took over, and away they went. One peculiarity of the whole operation is that everybody involved were virtually neighbors of each other in the upper-class Cesar Nicolas Persson and Avienda Pastor area. The American embassy was virtually adjacent to Trujillo's sprawling palace residence. The foreign colony took their kids to a competent young pediatrician who lived in that neighborhood. My house was a few blocks away, and I sent my daughter to him, too. Espaillat lived in the same general area. When we all started killing each other, it was practically a neighborhood brawl. Anyway, the family doctor was named Roberto Reed Cabral, and he was the contact man for the whole operation. The two American CIA agents communicated largely through him. To a lesser extent, they used Wimpy's supermarket in the same area. Wimpy's market was primarily used for another purpose, smuggling American arms into the country. Wimpy himself was a rather amiable, nondescript-looking character whose real name was Lorenzo Berry, an American. He had lived in the country for years. There was no evidence that Berry himself was actually a company agent. He was recruited for this one job. The two other Americans involved were rather unlikely-looking types to be investigating an assassination conspiracy. One was short, rather roly-poly, with a slow, soft southern accent. The other was tall, balding, bespectacled, and gave the general appearance of a high school mathematics teacher. Both were virtually neighbors of Dr. Reed Cabral, and it was there that they had a long series of contacts with the Dominicans. Both were attached to the embassy, but both made it plain to the conspirators that they worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, the company. There were about 40 Dominicans involved, most of them fairly prominent. You have to have experienced the Dominican Republic of those years to have known how fantastic that was. That a plot with so many people involved could have dragged on for almost a year without a leak. It's a little country and swarmed with informers, some of them for pay. Others reported any item of interest just to make brownie points with the old man. Actually, we did hear that something funny was going on at Wimpy's market, but nobody seemed interested. Trujillo, an ex-Marine, trusted Americans, and he had always cooperated closely with the company. What was going on at the market was indeed interesting. Automatic carbines, disassembled, were being smuggled into Wimpy's in containers of food. Even obsolete M1 rifles were shipped in. That seemed odd when the story finally came out because the country fairly bristled with weaponry, and the conspirators had access to excellent Belgian FN assault rifles. But the point was that the plotters wanted visible, physical evidence of U.S. support. Except for Antonio de la Masa, who was transfixed by hatred and beyond fear, they lived in mortal terror throughout the conspiracy. They wanted something more tangible than CIA promises and moral support, and they got it. But a fat lot of good it was going to do them. The conspirators were primarily concerned about knocking off Trujillo, but the CIA also insisted that there be at least equal preparation for actual seizure of power. Heir apparent of the Trujillo machine was his eldest son, Ramfis, and it was possible that he could take over the controls, leaving the situation unchanged. How to bottle up Ramfis? Answer: he flies to Europe periodically. When the hit is made, while he's there, he'll come flying back, his plane making a stopover in New York. He'll be scooped up there and hauled off. Sounded good to the boys. They organized into two components, the political group, numbering about 40, and an action group of 8 to 10 hitmen. Antonio de la Masa was, naturally, the real leader of the hit team. The actual assassins had the easiest job. For all his secret police and troops, Trujillo himself was only lightly guarded. His movements were virtually ritualistic, almost mechanical. You knew where he'd be at almost any given time. Everybody got more jittery as they waited for Ramfis to get off his ass and go to Europe again. Then came the CIA's Bay of Pigs debacle. The company became just as panicky as the Dominicans. Word was passed to call the whole thing off. The Dominicans refused. It was too late to turn back. Sooner or later, the story would have to come out, and the old man would have fed them to the sharks, inch by inch. Finally, Ramfis boarded an airliner for Europe. A week later, Trujillo was gunned down by those CIA-supplied carbines and M1s. I had never considered Ramfis very bright, but this time he wasn't so dumb. Instead of flying commercial, he chartered a plane and flew directly home. Meanwhile, Arturo Espaillat drove home from the scene of the assassination directly to the home of General Roman, who was to be provisional president, grabbed him, and began rounding up the conspirators. By the time Ramfis landed, Espaillat was in full control of the country. Ramfis showed his gratitude by locking Espaillat up too. He had good reason. I think I was as close to Espaillat as any man alive or dead. Sometimes, after a few drinks and a rehashing of the old days, I would look at him and say, "Arturo, you son of a bitch. Someday I'm gonna kill you." I always got the same response. He would laugh. He knew exactly what I was thinking, even though we never discussed it. "Roberto, mi hermano, don't talk like that. Besides, you'd have to stand at the end of a very long line for that." He would laugh again. He thought it was very funny. The reason Arturo came within a hair of sharing the same fate as the conspirators, but survived, was that nobody could possibly believe that Arturo could be mixed up with the CIA. Washington was almost hysterical on the subject of Espaillat. Besides, Arturo wasn't super Trujillista. Ramfis just couldn't quite bring himself to believe he was involved. He was released and went into exile, where I joined him in still another of his endless conspiracies. It had been no coincidence that Arturo had been at the scene when the old man got hit, nor that he grabbed all the right conspiratorial asses straight off, nor that he had taken over the Trujillo machine and was running the country until Ramfis fucked things up by not flying into the CIA net in New York. It was too much for Ramfis, even though he spared his life. But I realized what had happened. You have to understand how it was in those days. Everybody around Trujillo realized the show was about over. Many were frozen by fear of the future. Others, and I was one of them, were just plain exhausted, burnt out. I had worked tirelessly, 7 days a week for El Jefe for 5 years, in an atmosphere saturated with fear, assassinations, guerrilla invasions, terrorism, hysterical propaganda, rumors, plots, executions, and all the other pleasantries accompanying the crumbling of an absolute dictatorship. I said to hell with it, and grabbed for a girl and a bottle. Arturo, however, was neither burnt out or fearful. He was fascinated by the Trujillo machine. He thought he could keep it running. He also liked Trujillo's business policies. The old man owned a piece of just about everything in the country. Literally. Every time you bought a beer or laid a whore or sold a ton of sugar, the old man rang up the cash register. That intrigued Arturo. Not that he was directly involved in the conspiracy. He knew of it. He knew who was in on it and what they were going to do and when. And he short-circuited the story from reaching the top. It wasn't exactly treason. Espaillat was just nudging history a bit. But there was only one Trujillo. When Espaillat was hit in Lisbon, I'm sure that he accepted it fatalistically and without rancor. To him, that was just part of the game. If you deal yourself in, you can expect that sort of thing. But even in this business, there's some morality. Not much, but some. But Washington violates those few rules, such as not getting people killed unnecessarily. One thing you may have noticed is that U.S. spooks like to work through proxies, puppets, dupes, allies, or whatever you want to call it, and the results are usually unfortunate for the proxies. The Trujillo thing was an example. The 2 CIA men and Wimpy bolted from the country just before it happened. The promised support never materialized. The Americans were long gone and didn't try to help them. True, offshore was a very visible U.S. Navy task force, which arrived just after the assassination. The plotters had been told the Marines would land. They didn't. In the end, Washington did manage to kill Trujillo, but it was also responsible for the killing of a lot of other Dominicans as well. Arturo, hounded from his country by the company, finally took up residence in Lisbon. There he was involved in a car wreck which left him paralyzed. He later recovered enough to blow out his brains with his .45. "You know, Arturo's accident in Lisbon," the voices over the phone said. "Well, that was no accident. You're going to get the same thing." "Fuck you," I said.